The radio crackle came at 3:47 hours and it changed everything. Major David Kovach stood in the operations center at Bagram Airfield, staring at the green glow of the radar screen like it had just insulted his family. The voice on the other end was calm, almost bored, which made it worse. Bagram Actual, this is Warthog 2-1, requesting emergency landing clearance. Runway condition critical. How copy? Kovach keyed his mic. Warthog 2-1, negative on that request. Runway is compromised. I say again, runway is compromised. Divert to Kandahar. Acknowledge. There was a pause just long enough for Kovach to wonder if the pilot had heard him. Then the voice returned, still calm, still steady. Bagram Actual, Kandahar is not an option. Fuel state critical. Landing Bagram in 6 minutes. 2-1 out. Kovach's jaw tightened. He turned to the tower chief, a grizzled captain named Ortiz who had seen 3 deployments and had the lines on his face to prove it. Who the hell is 2-1? Ortiz checked the logs, scrolled, then stopped. Captain Vesna Radic, A-10 pilot, 31 years old, been flying hogs for 8 years. Call signs Ember. Kovach frowned. Ember, Ortiz shrugged. Guess she's got a temper or something. Records show she flew close air support in Helmand last year. Pulled a patrol out of a hot zone under heavy fire. Got a commendation, keeps to herself mostly. Kovach didn't care about commendations. He cared about the fact that his runway had taken mortar fire 2 hours ago and was currently a cratered mess of concrete and debris. The engineers had only just started clearing it. There was no way an aircraft could land safely, especially not a 30-ton ground attack jet built like a flying bathtub. Tell her again. She can't land here. Ortiz keyed the radio. Warthog 2-1, Bagram Tower. Runway is not cleared for landing. Repeat, not cleared. Divert immediately. The response was almost instant. Bagram Tower 2-1. I've got 1,700 pounds of fuel, 3 hydraulic warnings, and a fire light in the port engine. I'm landing. Clear the runway or don't. Your call. Kovach felt his pulse quicken. He stepped closer to the tower window, looking out over the dark expanse of the airfield. Somewhere out there, in the cold Afghan night, an A-10 Thunderbolt II was limping home on a prayer and fumes. And the pilot, this Captain Radic, was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. He wasn't sure which yet. The runway lights stretched out like a broken spine, illuminating the gaps where the mortars had hit. Kovach could see the engineering crew scrambling, their yellow vests catching the halogen glow as they dragged debris to the sides. It wasn't enough, not even close. He turned back to Ortiz. How long until she's in visual range? Ortiz checked the scope. 4 minutes, maybe less if she's pushing it. Kovach rubbed his eyes. He hadn't slept in 22 hours, and now he was about to watch someone die because they were too stubborn to follow orders. He keyed the radio himself this time. Warthog 2-1, this is Bagram Actual. What is your tactical situation? Can you maintain altitude and circle until we clear the field? There was a longer pause this time. When Radic's voice came back, it had lost some of its steadiness. Not much, but enough. Bagram Actual, negative. I'm losing altitude at 200 feet per minute. Port engine is toast. I've got maybe 3 minutes before I'm gliding. I'm coming in whether you like it or not. Clear the field or mark me down as a statistic. Radic out. Kovach closed his eyes. He thought about the last crash he'd witnessed, a Chinook that had clipped a ridge line on approach and came apart like a child's toy. He'd helped pull bodies from the wreckage. Some of them he'd known. Some of them he'd played cards with the night before. He opened his eyes and made the call. Ortiz, get everyone off the runway, now. Move the crash trucks to standby positions. If she's coming in, we're not going to let her burn alone. Ortiz nodded and grabbed the field radio, barking orders in rapid succession. The crew outside responded immediately, running toward the sides of the runway, dragging equipment, clearing a path that was still woefully inadequate. Kovach walked to the window and stared into the darkness. Somewhere out there, an A-10 was descending, its titanium bathtub fuselage holding a pilot who refused to quit. He didn't know her, didn't know what drove her or why she'd chosen this profession. But he knew one thing, she was about to do something either legendary or fatal. He just hoped it wasn't both. First sign of Warthog 2-1 was the sound. It came low and guttural, a rumble that vibrated through the operations center's walls before anyone saw the aircraft. Kavech pressed his face closer to the glass, scanning the black sky. Then he saw it, a silhouette against the stars, darker than the night itself, wings wide and ungainly, nose tilted down in a shallow glide. The looked like a creature from another era, all hard angles and brutal efficiency. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't meant to be. It was designed to take punishment and keep flying, to absorb gunfire and shrug it off like rain. But even a warthog had limits. Ortiz's voice crackled over the handheld radio. Tower, engineering says we've got maybe 60% of the runway clear. The rest is still rough. She's gonna feel every inch of it. Kavech didn't respond. He was watching the A-10 descend, its profile growing larger, the running lights blinking steadily on the wings. The port engine was trailing smoke, a thin gray line that streaked behind the aircraft like a scar. Warthog 2-1 Bagram Tower, you are cleared to land. Winds calm. Runway lights are on. Crash crews standing by. There was no acknowledgement this time. Radek was too busy flying. Kavech could see the nose dip slightly as the A-10 lined up with the runway, could see the subtle corrections in the wings as she fought to keep it stable. The aircraft was heavy, sluggish, responding to her inputs like a wounded animal. Then, impossibly, the landing gear dropped. 3 wheels extended into the slipstream, locking into place with a mechanical certainty that seemed defiant in the face of everything else going wrong. Kavech felt his breath catch. She was committed now. No turning back. They crossed the threshold at 200 feet, then 100. The nose stayed level, the wings steady despite the failing engine. Kavech could see the glow of the remaining turbofan, a dull orange light that flickered like a dying ember. The irony of the call sign wasn't lost on him. 50 feet, 30. The wheels kissed the concrete with a screech that echoed across the airfield. The A-10 bounced once, hard, then slammed down again, the landing gear compressing under the weight. Radek must have hit the brakes immediately because the nose dropped and the aircraft shuddered, vibrating as it decelerated. Then it hit the first crater. It lurched violently to the left, the nose wheel slamming into a jagged hole in the concrete. The entire fuselage twisted, and for a moment Kavech thought it would cartwheel, that the wing would catch the ground and the whole thing would disintegrate in a ball of fire and metal. But Radek corrected. Somehow, impossibly, she pulled the stick back and applied right rudder, dragging the nose out of the crater and forcing the aircraft back onto a straight line. The landing gear groaned audibly, a metallic shriek that carried across the airfield. Sparks flew from the undercarriage as the A-10 scraped over another piece of debris, a chunk of concrete that had been too big to move. The port wing dipped, scraping the ground, and Kavech saw a flash of orange as fuel ignited briefly, then died. The crash trucks were already moving, lights flashing, sirens blaring. They raced alongside the A-10 as it continued down the runway, slowing now, the brakes fighting against momentum and gravity and sheer bad luck. The aircraft was vibrating so hard Kavech could see it from the tower, could see the entire frame shaking like it was coming apart at the seams. Then, finally, mercifully, it stopped. The A-10 sat in the middle of the runway, engine silent except for the hiss of coolant and hydraulic fluid leaking onto the concrete. The canopy was still closed. For a long moment nothing moved. Kavech grabbed the radio. Warthog 2-1 Bagram Tower, status check, how copy, silence. Kavech's heart hammered in his chest. He keyed the mic again. Captain Radek, do you copy? Respond if able. More silence. Then slowly the canopy began to open. It moved in jerky increments, the hydraulics clearly damaged, but it moved. Kavech could see a figure inside, helmeted, moving deliberately. The pilot climbed out onto the wing, then dropped to the ground. She stood there for a moment, one hand on the fuselage, steadying herself. Then she walked away from the aircraft without looking back. Kavech exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes. Ortiz was grinning beside him. That, Ortiz said quietly, was the craziest damn thing I've ever seen. Kavech nodded slowly. He didn't disagree. Captain Vesna Radek walked across the tarmac with the kind of deliberate calm that only came from training or exhaustion, and Kavech suspected it was a mixture of both. The crash crews swarmed her A-10, spraying foam over the smoking port engine, checking for fuel leaks, securing the landing gear that had somehow held together despite the punishment it had taken. She ignored all of it. Her flight suit was stained with sweat and streaked with hydraulic fluid, her helmet still tucked under one arm. She was shorter than Kavach had expected, maybe 5'6", with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun beneath the helmet's impression. Her face was pale but composed, eyes sharp and focused despite the ordeal she'd just survived. Kavach met her at the edge of the runway, Ortiz a step behind. "Captain Radek," Kavach said, extending a hand. "Major David Kavach, you just scared the hell out of my entire operations team." Radek shook his hand briefly, her grip firm despite the tremor Kavach could feel in her fingers. "Didn't mean to cause a scene, Major, just needed a place to land." Her voice was steady, almost casual, but Kavach could hear the edge beneath it, the adrenaline still burning through her system. "You were told the runway was compromised," Kavach said, keeping his tone neutral. "You landed anyway." Radek met his gaze without flinching. "I was told Kandahar was an option. It wasn't. I had fuel for maybe another 4 minutes. I made the call." Kavach nodded slowly. He wanted to be angry, wanted to dress her down for ignoring orders and putting his crew at risk, but he'd seen the landing. He'd watched her pull that crippled aircraft down through the darkness and plant it on a runway that looked like a war zone. Whatever else she wasn't reckless. "What happened up there?" Ortiz asked, stepping forward. Radek glanced at him, then back at the A-10. "Got hit during a gun run near coast. Taliban convoy. Someone got lucky with a DSHK, took out the port engine and shredded the hydraulics. Lost half my control surfaces on the way back. Spent the last 40 minutes nursing her home." Kavach studied her expression. There was no pride there, no bravado. Just exhaustion and the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd survived something they shouldn't have. The debriefing room was bare and functional. All metal chairs and fluorescent lights that hummed like insects. Radek sat across from Kavach, a cup of lukewarm coffee in her hands that she hadn't touched. Ortiz leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching her with the kind of professional curiosity that came from years of dealing with pilots who thought they were invincible. Kavach opened the incident report on his laptop, the screen casting a pale glow across his face. "Walk me through it again. From the top." Radek sighed, setting the coffee down. "We got tasked with a close air support mission at 200. Taliban convoy moving south toward coast. Intelligence said they were transporting weapons, possibly IEDs. My wingman, Captain Voss, and I went in for a gun run. Standard approach, 30-degree dive, 1,200 feet. Kavach typed as she spoke, his fingers quick on the keyboard. "And that's when you took fire," Radek nodded. "Third pass. I was rolling in on the lead vehicle when I felt the impact. Whole aircraft shook. Alarms went off immediately. Fire warning, hydraulic pressure, engine failure. I broke off and headed west, tried to gain altitude, but the port engine was dead. Voss stayed on station to finish the run, then joined up on me for the flight back." Ortiz spoke up. "Why didn't you eject?" Radek's expression didn't change. "Because I didn't have to. The aircraft was still flying. Ejection's a last resort, Captain." "You know that?" Ortiz nodded slowly. "Fair enough, but you were losing altitude, you were losing control. Most pilots would have punched out over friendly territory and let the bird crash." Radek looked at him directly. "I'm not most pilots." There was no arrogance in her tone, just a simple statement of fact. Kavach found himself believing her. "What about Kandahar?" he asked. "Why didn't you divert?" Radek leaned back in her chair, her shoulders finally relaxing a fraction. "I ran the numbers. Kandahar was another 60 miles southwest. I didn't have the fuel. The math didn't work. Bagram was closer, even with the damaged runway. It was the only option that gave me a chance of walking away." Kavach studied her, searching for hesitation, for doubt. He found none. The story of the landing spread through Bagram faster than the morning sun. By the time Radek emerged from the debriefing, bleary-eyed and running on fumes, half the base knew her name. Pilots gathered in clusters near the flight line, pointing at the battered A-10 that sat like a wounded animal under the harsh floodlights. Engineers took photos of the cratered runway, measuring the skid marks, calculating the forces involved. Some of them whistled low when they saw the numbers. The A-10 had touched down at over 160 knots on a surface that shouldn't have supported a bicycle, let alone a combat aircraft. Radek ignored the attention. She walked to her quarters, a cramped plywood and canvas structure that smelled like dust and jet fuel, and collapsed onto the narrow cot without bothering to remove her flight suit. Sleep came hard and fast, dragging her under before she could think about what had happened, before the adrenaline could give way to the shakes that always came afterward. She dreamed of fire and smoke and the awful grinding sound of metal scraping concrete, and when she woke 3 hours later, her hands were clenched into fists. Outside, the base was alive with activity. Helicopters thundered overhead, their rotors beating the air into submission. Transport trucks rumbled past, kicking up dust that settled over everything like a second skin. Radek splashed water on her face from a basin, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror. She looked older than 31, older than she felt. The lines around her eyes had deepened, etched there by sun and stress and too many missions that had gone sideways. Her call sign, Ember, had been given to her during flight school. Not because of a temper, though she had one, but because of the way she flew. Controlled burns, they called them, calculated aggression. She never flew reckless, never took unnecessary risks, but when the mission required it, she could push an aircraft to its absolute limits and bring it back in one piece. Usually. She dressed quickly, pulling on a clean flight suit, and headed for the operations center. Kavach had requested a follow-up meeting, probably to chew her out properly now that the adrenaline had worn off. Kavach was waiting for her in his office, a cramped space lined with maps and incident reports and photos of aircraft that had seen better days. He gestured for her to sit, then closed the door behind her. "How are you feeling?" he asked, settling into his chair. Radek shrugged. "Tired, sore, alive." Kavach allowed himself a small smile. "That's more than most people could say after what you did last night." Radek didn't respond. She wasn't good with compliments, never had been. They felt like traps, like setups for disappointment. Kavach leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "I read the full report from Captain Voss. He said you stayed on target longer than you should have. Said you made 3 passes when most pilots would have made one and called it a day." Radek met his gaze evenly. "The convoy was still moving. If we'd broken off early, they would have scattered, gone to ground. We'd have lost them." Kavach nodded. "So you pressed, even after you took the hit." "I pressed because the mission required it." Kavach studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he slid a folder across the desk. "This is a commendation letter. I'm recommending you for a Distinguished Flying Cross. What you did last night was beyond exceptional. You saved your aircraft and potentially your life by refusing to quit." Radek picked up the folder, flipped it open, scanned the first few lines. Then she closed it and set it back on the desk. "With respect, Major, I don't need a medal. I need my aircraft fixed so I can get back to work." Kavach raised an eyebrow. "You do realize that most pilots would kill for a DFC, right?" Radek's expression didn't change. "I'm not most pilots." Kavach laughed, a short, genuine sound. "Yeah, I'm starting to figure that out." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with renewed interest. "Where are you from, Radek? Before the Air Force, I mean." Radek hesitated. She didn't talk about her past much, didn't see the point, but there was something in Kavach's tone that made her answer. "Sarajevo. My family emigrated when I was 8, right before the siege got bad. We ended up in Michigan." "You remember the war?" Kavach asked quietly. Radek nodded slowly. "Pieces of it, the sound of mortars at night, the way my mother would grab us and pull us into the hallway whenever the shelling started, the empty grocery stores. My father worked for the government before everything fell apart. He used to say the sky belonged to everyone, that no one could take it away." She paused, her jaw tightening. "Then the planes came and he stopped saying that." Kavach watched her carefully. "Is that why you became a pilot?" Radek considered the question. "Maybe, I don't know, I just knew I wanted to be the one in the sky, not the one on the ground hopping the bombs missed." Kavach nodded, understanding more than she'd said. "You've been flying hogs for 8 years. That's a long time in one platform. Ever think about transitioning to fighters, F-16s, F-15s? Radek shook her head. "Fighters are for air superiority. The hog is for the grunts on the ground. I like knowing that when I show up, someone down there is going home because of it." Kavach smiled faintly. "You sound like every other A-10 pilot I've ever met. They all think they're saving the world." Radek's expression softened just a fraction. "We are. one gun run at a time. The conversation drifted after that, touching on mundane topics: logistics, maintenance schedules, the quality of the dining facility food, which was universally terrible. But Kovac found himself respecting Radic more with each passing minute. She wasn't flashy. She didn't crave attention or accolades. She just did her job with a level of competence and dedication that was rare, even among the best pilots he'd known. When she finally stood to leave, Kovac stopped her at the door. "Radic," she turned, one hand on the doorframe. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you didn't eject. The Air Force needs more pilots like you." Radic held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once. "Thank you, sir." Then she was gone, leaving Kovac alone with his thoughts and the quiet hum of the air conditioning. The hangar where Radic's A-10 sat was a cathedral of grease and metal, high-ceilinged and echoing with the sound of tools clanging against steel. The aircraft looked worse in daylight, its fuselage scarred with shrapnel holes, the port engine blackened and twisted, the landing gear bent at angles that shouldn't have been possible. Chief Master Sergeant Elias Hawk stood beside it, a clipboard in one hand and a look of professional dismay on his weathered face. Radic approached slowly, running her hand along the wing's leading edge. "How bad is it, Chief?" Hawk glanced at her, then back at the A-10. "Bad. Port engine's a total loss. We'll need to swap it out, which means at least 3 days of work, maybe more. Hydraulics are shot to hell. You've got damage to the flight control systems, the landing gear, the fuselage. Honestly, Captain, I'm amazed this bird didn't come apart on landing." Radic nodded, absorbing the information without emotion. "Fix her?" Hawk snorted. "Can I fix her, Captain? I can fix anything. The question is whether it's worth fixing." Radic's eyes narrowed. "She got me home, that makes her worth it." Hawk studied her for a moment, then grinned. "Damn right it does. All right, we'll get her back in the air. Give me a week, maybe 10 days. She'll fly again." Radic felt a knot in her chest loosen. "Thank you, Chief." Hawk waved her off. "Don't thank me yet. You're gonna owe me a beer when this is done. Maybe 2. Radic smiled, a rare expression that softened her features. "You got it." She spent the next hour in the hangar watching the maintenance crews work, listening to their chatter, absorbing the rhythm of the repairs. They moved with practiced efficiency, pulling panels, disconnecting fuel lines, marking damaged components for replacement. Some of them glanced at her curiously, whispering to each other when they thought she wasn't listening. She heard the words crazy and lucky more than once. She didn't correct them. Luck had nothing to do with it. It was training, instinct, and a refusal to quit that had brought her home. Luck was for people who left things to chance. By the end of the week, Radic had fallen back into the rhythm of deployment life. Early mornings spent in the briefing room, poring over intelligence reports and target packages. Afternoons in the simulator, practicing emergency procedures until her hands moved automatically, muscle memory overriding conscious thought. Evenings in the ready room, playing cards with the other pilots, listening to their stories, contributing little to the conversation but absorbing everything. She was respected now in a way she hadn't been before the landing. The other pilots nodded when she entered a room, made space for her at the table, asked her opinion on tactics and procedures. It was a subtle shift, but she felt it. Captain Eli Voss, her wingman, cornered her in the mess hall one night. He was younger than her, maybe 27, with the kind of easy confidence that came from growing up without hardship. "Hey, Ember," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. "Heard Kovac put you in for a DFC." Radic shrugged, picking at her meal. "He did," Voss grinned. "That's huge, you deserve it." Radic didn't respond. She never knew what to say when people told her she deserved things. Voss leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Listen, I wanted to say thanks for staying on target that night. I know you took the hit because you were covering me." Radic looked up, meeting his eyes. "I took the hit because I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. It wasn't about you." Voss shook his head. "Bullshit. You stayed low so I could set up my run. You drew their fire. I know how it works." Radic set down her fork. "Voss, we were doing our job, that's all. Stop trying to make it more than it was." Voss studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but for what it's worth, I'm glad you were up there with me." Radic felt something shift in her chest, a warmth she wasn't used to. "Me too," she said quietly. Voss grinned and stood, clapping her on the shoulder before heading back to his own table. Radic watched him go, then returned to her meal, feeling a little less alone. The Distinguished Flying Cross ceremony was held in the late afternoon, when the heat had faded to something almost bearable. Kavach presided, standing on a makeshift stage near the flight line, the battered A-10 visible in the background like a monument to stubbornness and skill. The entire squadron had turned out, along with support personnel, maintenance crews, and a handful of senior officers who'd flown in from Kabul specifically for the occasion. Radek stood at attention in her dress uniform, uncomfortable under the weight of so many eyes. She hated ceremonies, hated the pomp and formality, but she endured it because refusing would have been worse. Kavach read the citation aloud, his voice carrying across the tarmac. For extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight as an A-10C pilot near coast, Afghanistan. Captain Radek displayed exceptional airmanship and courage under fire, completing her mission despite catastrophic damage to her aircraft, and subsequently executing a landing under conditions that would have defeated a lesser pilot. Her actions reflect great credit upon herself and the United States Air Force. He stepped forward, holding the medal, and pinned it to her uniform. The small bronze cross felt heavier than it should have. "Congratulations, Captain," Kavach said quietly. "You've earned this." Radek saluted, her movements crisp despite the discomfort. "Thank you, sir." The assembled crowd applauded, a wave of sound that washed over her. She scanned the faces, saw Voss grinning like an idiot, saw Hawk nodding approvingly, saw Ortiz giving her a thumbs up from the back. And for a moment, just a moment, she let herself feel proud. The reception afterward was informal, held in one of the base's larger tents. Someone had scrounged up soda and snacks, and the mood was celebratory despite the ongoing war just beyond the wire. Radek found herself surrounded by well-wishers, pilots and crew chiefs and officers she barely knew, all offering congratulations and handshakes. She accepted them with as much grace as she could muster, but after an hour she slipped away, needing air, needing space. She walked to the edge of the flight line, where the noise faded and the sky opened up above her, vast and indifferent. Kavach found her there 20 minutes later. He approached quietly, hands in his pockets, and stood beside her without speaking. They watched the sun sink toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Radek of fire. "You okay?" Kavach asked eventually. Radek nodded. "Just needed a minute." Kavach smiled faintly. "I get it, ceremonies aren't for everyone." They stood in comfortable silence for a while. Then Kavach spoke again, his tone more serious. "I've been thinking about what you said, about being the one in the sky instead of on the ground." Radek glanced at him. "Yeah, it takes a certain kind of person to do that, to take that responsibility. Most people would run from it." Radek turned her gaze back to the horizon. "Most people didn't grow up hearing mortars." Kavach nodded slowly. "Fair point, but even so, you could have walked away after flight school, could have flown transports, tankers, something safe. You chose the hog. You chose combat." Radek considered that. "I guess I did." "Why?" Radek didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quiet. "Because someone has to, and if it's not me, it's someone else. Someone who might not care as much, someone who might not try as hard." Kavach looked at her with something approaching admiration. "That's the right answer," Radek shrugged. "It's the only answer I have." They stood together until the sun disappeared completely, leaving only stars and the distant glow of the base lights. Then Kavach clapped her gently on the shoulder and walked back toward the tents. Radek stayed a while longer, watching the sky, thinking about the path that had brought her here. She thought about her father's words, about the sky belonging to everyone. She thought about the convoy near coast, the Taliban fighters who wouldn't hurt anyone else because she'd been there to stop them. She thought about the landing, the way the A-10 had shuddered beneath her, the way she'd refused to let it fall. And she thought about tomorrow and the mission after that and all the ones that would follow. 3 weeks after the ceremony, Radek was back in the cockpit. The A-10 had been repaired, better than new according to Hawk, who'd overseen every rivet and weld personally. The port engine purred smoothly, the hydraulics responded with precision, and the landing gear was solid as bedrock. Radek ran through her pre-flight checks with the same meticulous care she always did, her hands moving over switches and dials, her eyes scanning instruments, her mind cataloging every detail. Voss was her wingman again, flying off her left side as they lifted off from Bagram and banked south toward the mountains. The mission was straightforward: reconnaissance over a suspected Taliban staging area, with authorization to engage if targets presented themselves. The flight out was smooth, the sky clear except for a few high clouds that cast shadows over the valleys below. Radek scanned the terrain with practiced efficiency, marking landmarks, noting potential threats, staying alert. The radio was quiet except for the occasional check-in from other aircraft in the area. Then the call came. Warthog 2-1, this is Bulldog 6. We are taking effective fire from a compound at Grid November Delta 4723. Request immediate close air support. Multiple casualties. How copy? Radek keyed her mic instantly. Bulldog 6, Warthog 2-1 copies all. Inbound your position. Authenticate Bravo Tango. Warthog 2-1, authenticate Charlie Sierra. We are marked with orange panels. Enemy position is north of our location, stone compound with green roof, danger close. Radek felt the familiar surge of adrenaline sharpening her focus. Bulldog 6-2-1, copy danger close. 30 seconds out, keep your heads down. She banked hard, dropping altitude, scanning for the orange panels. Voss stayed tight on her wing, mirroring her movements. The compound came into view exactly as described, muzzle flashes visible even in daylight. Radek armed her cannon, the GAU-8 Avenger spooling up with a sound like a chainsaw. Bulldog 6-2-1 is in hot, heads down. She rolled in, lining up the shot, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. The world narrowed to the target, the reticle, the calculations running through her mind. Then she squeezed. The GAU-8 roared to life, firing 70 rounds per second, each one the size of a beer bottle. The sound was apocalyptic, a deep tearing growl that echoed off the mountains. The compound disintegrated under the onslaught, stone walls exploding, dust and debris erupting into the air. Radek held the trigger for 2 seconds, then broke off, pulling up and banking left. Bulldog 6, splash, assess. There was a pause, then the voice came back, breathless and relieved. Warthog 2-1, that's a good hit. Enemy fire has ceased. You just saved our asses. Bulldog 6 sends. Radek allowed herself a small smile. Bulldog 6, glad we could help. 2-1 is off target. Call if you need us. She climbed back to altitude, adrenaline still humming through her veins. Voss's voice came over the radio. Nice shooting, Ember. That was textbook. Radek keyed her mic. Thanks, Voss. Let's do another pass, make sure they're done. They circled the area for another 20 minutes, scanning for additional threats, but the compound was silent, the enemy either dead or scattered. Radek finally called it and turned north, heading back toward Bagram. The flight home was quiet, the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon. Radek let herself relax a fraction, her grip on the stick loosening, her breathing slowing. This was what she lived for, not the medals or the recognition, but this. The knowledge that somewhere below, soldiers were walking away from a firefight because she'd been there, that was worth everything. When they landed, Hawk was waiting on the flight line, arms crossed, grinning. Heard you got some trigger time today, he said as Radek climbed down. Radek nodded. A little. Hawk walked around the A-10, inspecting it with a critical eye. No holes this time, I appreciate that. Radek laughed, a sound that surprised her. I'll do my best to keep it that way, Chief. Hawk clapped her on the shoulder. You do that, Captain. This bird's starting to grow on me. Weeks turned into months, and Radek settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Missions blurred together, each one a variation on the same theme. Fly out, find the enemy, deliver ordnance, fly home. She became a fixture in the squadron, the pilot others looked to when things went sideways. Her call sign took on a new meaning. Ember wasn't just about controlled burns anymore. It was about resilience, about the small flame that refused to die no matter how hard the wind blew. Kavach noticed the shift. He started assigning her to the toughest missions, the ones that required precision and nerve, and she never disappointed. Other pilots began requesting her as their wingman, trusting her judgment, her skill, her unshakable calm under fire. But Radek never let it go to her head. She remained quiet, focused, deflecting praise and avoiding the spotlight whenever possible. She was there to do a job, nothing more, nothing less. One night, Voss asked her about it. They were sitting outside their quarters, staring at the stars, exhausted from a mission that had stretched into 12 hours. "Do you ever think about what happens after?" Voss asked. Radek glanced at him. "After what?" "After this, the war, the deployment, all of it. Do you ever think about going home?" Radek considered the question. "Sometimes, but home feels like a different planet right now." Voss nodded. "I get that. I think about it a lot. My girl back in Texas, my family. But then I'm up there and it's like nothing else matters." Radek understood exactly what he meant. "Yeah, it's like that for me too." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of unspoken thoughts hanging between them. Then Voss spoke again. "You're the best pilot I've ever flown with, Ember, I mean that." Radek felt her throat tight. "Thanks, Voss, that means a lot." Voss smiled. "Just don't let it go to your head." Radek laughed softly. "I'll do my best." The mission that would define Radek's deployment came on a cold December morning. Intelligence had identified a high-value target, a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks across the region. He was holed up in a compound near the Pakistani border, surrounded by fighters and protected by terrain that made a ground assault nearly impossible. Radek and Voss were tasked with the strike. The briefing was tense, the stakes higher than usual. Kavach laid out the plan with precision, detailing the target location, the rules of engagement, the expected threats. "This one's critical," Kavach said, his gaze sweeping the room. "If we take this guy out, it'll disrupt their entire network, but it's not going to be easy. The compound is heavily defended. Expect small arms fire, possibly MA and PADs. You'll need to be smart, fast, and precise." Radek nodded, absorbing the information. Beside her, Voss was doing the same, his expression serious. Kavach's eyes settled on Radek. "Ember, your flight lead on this one. I'm trusting you to make the call on how to approach." Radek met his gaze steadily. "Understood, sir." The flight out was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Radek led the way, Voss on her wing, both of them flying low to avoid radar detection. The mountains rose around them, jagged and unforgiving, the valleys below shrouded in shadow. They approached the target from the east, using the terrain to mask their approach. Radek scanned the area, marking the compound, noting the defensive positions, calculating angles and distances. "Warthog Flight, this is Overlord. You are cleared hot. Target is the central structure. Minimize collateral damage." Radek keyed her mic. "Overlord 2-1 copies. Warthog Flight is in hot." She rolled in, diving toward the compound, her cannon already armed. The world narrowed to the target, the reticle, the moment of release. Then the sky erupted with gunfire. Tracer rounds arced toward her, bright lines of death stitching through the air. Radek jinked hard, breaking left, the responding instantly. She heard the sharp crack of rounds hitting the fuselage, felt the aircraft shudder, but she held her line. She squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 spoke with its characteristic roar, obliterating the compound's central structure in a matter of seconds. Stone and wood exploded outward, bodies tumbling, flames erupting. Radek pulled off target, climbing hard, checking her instruments. Alarms were blaring, hydraulic pressure dropping, fire warning again. "Voss, I'm hit," she said calmly. "Taking over as flight lead, make your run." Voss didn't hesitate. "Copy, Ember, inbound." Radek circled, fighting the controls as Voss rolled in and delivered his ordnance, finishing the job. The compound was a smoking crater by the time he pulled off. "Overlord, Warthog Flight, target destroyed. Ember is damaged and egressing." Radek turned north, nursing the A-10 as it struggled to respond. The fire warning was persistent, the hydraulics failing faster than before. She ran through her emergency procedures, isolating systems, rerouting power, doing everything she could to keep the aircraft flying. Voss pulled alongside, scanning her fuselage. "Ember, you're leaking fuel, port side. You need to get on the ground now." Radek nodded, her jaw set. "Working on it." Bagram was 60 miles away. Kandahar was closer, but still 40 miles. Neither felt reachable. Then she saw it, a stretch of road, straight and relatively flat, cutting through the valley below. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than punching out. "Voss, I'm putting her down on that road. Stay high and cover me." Voss's voice was strained. "Ember, that's crazy. Eject. Let the bird go." Radek's response was immediate. "Negative, I'm landing." She dropped altitude, lining up with the road, ignoring the alarms, ignoring the fire spreading in the port engine, ignoring everything except the task at hand. The A-10 bucked and shuddered, fighting her every input, but she held it steady. The road rushed up to meet her. She cut power, pulled back on the stick, and felt the wheels touch down. The landing was brutal. The A-10 bounced hard, the nose slamming down, the landing gear screaming in protest. Radek hit the brakes, but the road was rough, unpaved in places, and the aircraft skidded sideways. For a moment she thought she'd lose it, that the A-10 would flip and break apart. But she corrected, wrenching the stick, applying rudder, and somehow, impossibly, brought it to a stop. The A-10 sat in the middle of the road, smoke pouring from the port engine, fuel pooling beneath the fuselage. Radek popped the canopy and climbed out, her legs shaky, her heart hammering. Voss circled overhead, his voice frantic on the radio. "Ember, you good? Talk to me." Radek keyed her handheld radio. "I'm good, Voss. Aircraft's a mess, but I'm good." Voss let out a long breath. "You are absolutely insane. You know that, right?" Radek smiled despite herself. "Yeah, I've heard that before." She stood beside the A-10, watching the smoke rise into the cold morning air. In the distance, she could hear the sound of helicopters approaching, the rescue team already inbound. She'd made it, again. When the helicopters arrived, the crew stared at the A-10 in disbelief. One of them, a young sergeant, approached Radek with wide eyes. "Ma'am, how the hell did you land this thing on a road?" Radek shrugged, exhausted. "Carefully." The sergeant laughed, shaking his head. "You pilots are something else." They loaded her onto the helicopter, lifting off and leaving the A-10 behind. Radek watched it shrink below her, a battered, smoking testament to stubbornness and skill. She'd flown it into hell twice now and brought it back both times. She wasn't sure how many more times she could do it, but she knew she'd try, because that's what she did. That's who she was. Ember, the flame that refused to die. The story of the road landing spread even faster than the first. By the time Radek was back at Bagram, debriefed and cleared by medical, she'd become something of a legend. Pilots from other squadrons sought her out, asking questions, wanting to hear the story firsthand. She deflected most of them, uncomfortable with the attention, but the reputation stuck. Kavech called her into his office the day after she returned. He looked older, more tired than she'd ever seen him. "Sit down, Radek," he said, gesturing to the chair. She sat waiting. Kavech leaned back, studying her. "I don't know whether to court-martial you or put you in for another medal." Radek said nothing. Kavech sighed. "You saved that aircraft again, but you also took a risk that could have gotten you killed. You know that, right?" Radek nodded. "I do." "So why didn't you eject?" Radek met his gaze. "Because I didn't have to. The aircraft was flyable. I made the call." Kavech shook his head slowly. "You're going to give me a heart attack, Radek." Radek allowed herself a small smile. "I'll try not to, sir." Kavech laughed despite himself. "All right, get out of here, and for God's sake try to keep the next one in the air." Radek stood, saluted, and left. Outside, Voss was waiting. He fell into step beside her. "So, what'd he say?" Radek shrugged. "Told me not to crash anymore." Voss grinned. "Good advice." They walked in silence for a moment. Then Voss spoke again. "You know you're kind of a big deal now." Radek glanced at him. "I'm really not." "Yeah, you are. People look up to you, Ember. You're what they want to be." Radek didn't know how to respond to that. She'd never wanted to be anyone's hero. She just wanted to do her job. "Well," she said finally, "they should probably set their sights a little lower." Voss laughed. "Too late for that." As the months wore on, Radek's deployment began to wind down. Missions became less frequent, the Taliban's activity ebbing as winter deepened and the mountain passes filled with snow. She spent more time in the ready room, mentoring younger pilots, sharing lessons learned, passing on the knowledge that had kept her alive. One of them, a lieutenant named Sarah Kwan, reminded Radek of herself. Quiet, focused, hungry to prove herself. Kwan sought Radek out one evening, finding her alone in the maintenance hangar, inspecting her A-10. "Captain Radek," Kwan said hesitantly. Radek turned. "Yeah, I was wondering if I could ask you something." Radek gestured for her to continue. Kwan shifted uncomfortably. "How do you deal with the fear when you're up there and things go wrong?" Radek considered the question carefully. "You don't deal with it, you use it. Fear keeps you sharp, keeps you focused. The moment you stop being afraid is the moment you get complacent, and complacent pilots don't come home." Kwan nodded slowly. "But what if you freeze? What if you can't think?" Radek's expression softened. Then you fall back on your training, you trust the procedures, trust your instincts. Your body knows what to do even when your brain doesn't. Quan looked relieved. Thank you, ma'am, that helps. Radek watched her leave, feeling a strange sense of continuity. She'd been where Quan was once, uncertain and searching for guidance. Someone had helped her then, and now she was doing the same. The cycle continued. When Radek's replacement orders finally came through, she felt a strange mix of relief and reluctance. She was ready to leave, ready for hot showers and decent food and nights without mortar alarms. But part of her didn't want to go. This place, brutal as it was, had become her home. Kavech threw her a small farewell gathering, nothing fancy, just the squadron and some of the crew chiefs. Hawk presented her with a piece of shrapnel from her first landing, mounted on a plaque. "So you don't forget," he said gruffly. Radek held it, feeling the weight. "I won't, thank you, Chief." Voss gave a short speech, stumbling over his words, talking about her skill and courage. Radek felt her throat tighten. When it was her turn to speak, she kept it brief. "I've been lucky to fly with all of you. You're the best squadron I've ever been part of. Take care of each other." The gathering broke up eventually, people drifting away, leaving Radek alone with her thoughts. She walked to the flight line one last time, standing beneath the stars, listening to the wind. Tomorrow she'd be gone, but the memories, the lessons, the people, they'd stay with her. Forever. Radek's flight out of Bagram was uneventful. A C-130 transport loaded with personnel rotating home. She stared out the window as the base shrank below her, the mountains receding into the distance, and felt a chapter of her life closing. The return to the States was jarring. Everything felt too clean, too bright, too safe. She spent her first week at her home station processing out, attending debriefings, filling out paperwork that seemed designed to drive her insane. She was assigned to a training squadron at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, tasked with instructing the next generation of A-10 pilots. It was a good assignment, prestigious even, but it felt hollow compared to the missions she'd flown in Afghanistan. The first time she stepped into a classroom, facing a room full of young pilots who looked at her with a mixture of awe and curiosity, she felt out of place. But then she started talking, sharing the lessons she'd learned, the mistakes she'd made, the decisions that had kept her alive. And she realized this mattered too. One of her students, a cocky captain named Tors, challenged her during a briefing. "Ma'am, with all due respect, the landing you did at Bagram, wasn't that just luck? I mean the odds of pulling that off." Radek fixed him with a steady gaze. "It wasn't luck, Captain. It was training, preparation, and a refusal to quit. Luck is what happens when you run out of options. I still had options." Tors nodded slowly, chastened. "Understood, ma'am." Radek softened her tone. "But you're right that the odds were against me. They usually are. That's why you train for the worst and hope for the best. That's why you never give up, no matter how bad it looks." The room was silent, absorbing her words. Radek felt a flicker of satisfaction. She was making a difference here too, in a different way. The months at Nellis blurred together. She flew training sorties, graded exercises, mentored students who reminded her of herself years ago. Some of them would go on to combat deployments, and she hoped her lessons would keep them alive. She thought about Afghanistan often, about the missions, the people, the moments that had defined her. She stayed in touch with Voss, who'd extended his deployment for another rotation. His emails were brief but warm, updates on the squadron, news from Bagram. Kavech had been promoted and transferred to Germany. Hawk had retired, finally, after 30 years of wrenching on jets. One evening, Radek received an unexpected email. It was from Quan, the young lieutenant she'd mentored. The subject line read simply, "Thank you." Radek opened it, curious. "Captain Radek, I wanted to let you know that I made it through my first deployment. There were a few times when things got bad, and I remembered what you told me, about using the fear, about trusting my training. It helped. I'm grateful for the time you spent with me. I hope I can be half the pilot you are. Respectfully, LT. Sarah Quan." Radek read the message twice, feeling something shift in her chest. She'd spent so long focused on her own missions, her own survival, that she'd forgotten the ripple effect. The way one pilot's actions could inspire another, could save a life indirectly. She typed a brief response, encouraging Quan to keep pushing, to never settle. Then she closed the laptop and stared out the window at the Nevada desert, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and red. She thought about her father, about his words regarding the sky. She thought about the mortars in Sarajevo, the fear that had driven her to become a pilot. She thought about every mission she'd flown, every landing she'd survived, every student she'd taught. And she realized something. Her story wasn't just about her. It was about everyone she'd flown with, everyone she'd saved, everyone she'd inspired. It was a legacy built not on medals or recognition, but on the quiet, steady flame of dedication and courage. The flame that refused to die. Years passed. Radek continued teaching, continued flying, continued building that legacy one student at a time. She earned a promotion to major, then lieutenant colonel. She commanded a squadron, led training exercises, mentored hundreds of pilots. Some of them went on to become legends in their own right, crediting her as the reason. The story of the Bagram landing became part of Air Force lore, taught in classrooms, referenced in briefings. Radek herself became a symbol of resilience and skill, a reminder that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about facing fear and pushing through anyway. She gave lectures at the Air Force Academy, stood on stages in front of cadets and told them the truth. That flying was hard. That combat was terrifying. That there would be moments when everything went wrong and survival seemed impossible. But that if they trained hard, trusted their instincts, and refused to quit, they could do things they never thought possible. One day, nearly a decade after the Bagram landing, Radek received an invitation. The Air Force was dedicating a new training facility and they wanted her to speak at the ceremony. She accepted, curious. When she arrived, she was stunned to see her name on the building. The Captain Vesna Ember, Radek Close Air Support Training Center. She stood in front of the plaque, reading the inscription, dedicated to the memory of courage, resilience, and the unwavering determination to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Tears stung her eyes. She'd never expected this, never wanted it. But standing there, surrounded by young pilots who looked at her with admiration and respect, she understood. Her story mattered. Not because she was special, but because she'd proven that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when the stakes demanded it. The ceremony was brief. Radek gave a short speech, thanking everyone, deflecting the praise as always. But when it was over and the crowd had dispersed, she stood alone in front of the building, staring at her name. She thought about the girl from Sarajevo, terrified of the sky. She thought about the young pilot struggling to prove herself. She thought about the countless missions, the close calls, the moments of doubt. And she thought about the flame, the ember that had started small and uncertain but had grown into something fierce and unstoppable, a light that refused to be extinguished. Radek retired from the Air Force at the rank of colonel after 25 years of service. The ceremony was held at Nellie's, attended by former students, fellow pilots and friends she'd made over the decades. Voss flew in from Texas, older now, gray creeping into his hair, but still grinning like the young captain she'd flown with in Afghanistan. Kovac sent a video message from his retirement home in Florida, congratulating her and reminiscing about the night she'd landed at Bagram. "You scared the hell out of me, Radek," he said, smiling. "But you also taught me something, that there are people in this world who simply refuse to be beaten. You're one of them. Congratulations on an incredible career." Radek watched the message, feeling the weight of the years. She'd given everything to the Air Force, and it had given her a life she could never have imagined. In retirement, Radek settled in a small town in Montana, far from bases and flight lines. She bought a house with a view of the mountains, spent her days hiking and reading, and occasionally gave talks at local schools about aviation and service. But she never forgot. She kept her uniform in the closet, her medals in a drawer, her memories sharp and vivid. She thought about the people she'd saved, the missions she'd flown, the students she'd taught. And she knew that even though she was no longer flying, her legacy continued. Somewhere, a young pilot was pulling back on the stick, fighting to save an aircraft. Somewhere, a student was remembering her words, using fear to sharpen their focus. Somewhere, the flame was still burning. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Radek thought about her father. She wondered what he would think of the life she'd built, the choices she'd made. She hoped he'd be proud. The sky belonged to everyone, he'd said, and she'd spent her life proving it, not by taking it but by protecting it. By being the one in the air, so others on the ground could live without fear. The sky was vast and indifferent, but she'd carved her name into it, not with arrogance but with quiet determination. And that, she thought, was enough. Years later, a documentary filmmaker reached out to Radek. He'd heard her story, wanted to tell it to a wider audience. She was hesitant at first, uncomfortable with the attention, but he was persistent. "This isn't just about you," he said. "It's about what you represent. Courage, resilience, the refusal to quit. People need to hear that." So she agreed. The documentary took months to film. They interviewed former students, fellow pilots, crew chiefs who'd worked on her aircraft. They visited Bagram, now abandoned, the runway still scarred from the landing. They found footage of her missions, grainy and raw, and paired it with her narration. When the documentary premiered, it went viral. Millions watched the story of the pilot who'd landed on a cratered runway, who'd put an A-10 down on a mountain road, who'd spent her career proving that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about pushing through fear. The comments section exploded with admiration and respect. "This is what a hero looks like. She's a legend. I want to be like her." Radek watched the documentary once, alone in her living room. She saw herself on screen, younger, confident, talking about missions and decisions and the choices that had defined her. And she saw the impact she'd had, the lives she'd touched, the legacy she'd built. When it was over, she sat in silence for a long time. Then she smiled. Her father had been right. The sky belonged to everyone. And she'd spent her life defending that truth. The documentary ended with a question from the filmmaker. "If you could go back, would you do it all again?" Radek didn't hesitate. Every second of it. Because that's who she was, Ember, the flame that refused to die, and her story finally was complete.